when you collect that data, you want to collect it and then you form the hypothesis after you collect the data. And that gets into grounded theory, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But most of the time, you're not going to have a, well, any time really, you're not going to have a hypothesis to begin the study. What you're going to have is a question. Once you have the question, then you get the data, and then you can form a hypothesis afterwards. So it's a little bit backwards compared to quantitative. You don't want to have a hypothesis and prove it. What you want to do is figure out what happens, and then you can deduce that afterwards. So you're basically forming a hypothesis after you get the data and after you see what has happened. That's why it's a little different. And then the last difference is the meaning is essential, okay? That's what we want to know. Why is it important? The meaning of what happened. So, as we waited for the video, why is it important for us to have the video here, okay? That's just a simple question, but that's what, the meaning of it is what's important, not necessarily, okay, what happens after it. So, qualitative-wise, there's lots of different ways to do it, and we'll go over a few of them. We won't go over all of them because there's quite a few. But just a few of the different things. So does that make sense a little bit, the difference there? We don't want to know necessarily, we'll get results, but the results tell us what happened. They don't necessarily, we didn't predict it. Okay, we're not going to say this is what's going to happen. What we're going to say is, why is this happening? And then we find out why it's happening. So if you're looking at certain things, have you guys started making statements at all? Mm-hmm. You've had some problem statements?
Well, meaning like for our own research, or
like what you're thinking about doing? Mm-hmm. So what kind of things are you thinking about doing?
Well, when I talked to Dr. Walk,
Yeah.
it might be about if female athletes have better body perception than non-female college
Okay.
athletes. So my question, or she told me to phrase it like this:
Yes.
the purpose of this study is to investigate why college female athletes have better body image than females who are not.
The females that are not athletic females.
Yeah, I haven't figured out how to word that last part.
Yeah. Okay, so that could be either way. And almost every statement, you could go either way, either quantitative or qualitative. Because you want to know that why they have better body image, or do you want to know, do they have better body image?
Well,
Those are,
yeah.
they sound the same, but they're very different.
Yeah.
Because so depending on what you want to find out from that statement will depend on which way you go. Okay? So what kind of thing are you looking at?
Some type of ACL prevention.
ACL prevention,
Like
okay.
specifically like here.
Okay.
It's our fields or something. I don't know. I'm not
With Division II athletes maybe?
With, you know, like soccer and
Okay.
female soccer and basketball, I think that's right.
Okay, female soccer, basketball athletes, do you want to know percentage of females that have ACL injuries or why they have ACL
I
injuries?
gotta do why. So
Why they have them?
Yeah.
Now that can go either way too, because of the specificity of it, which is good, the why may be because of certain exercises or certain ways that they grew up, and not because of a process. So you could do that quantitatively still. So why doesn't always mean that you're going to do qualitative. What it means is you need to kind of separate it out a little bit and see exactly what you want to look at. Okay. You want to look at exercise to prevent, or okay. So that's probably going to be more quantitative because you're going to do experimental on how to prevent those types types of things, and that's going to be more, this will help and this won't. It's not really the process. That's the end result, is what we're looking at.
Mine is recruiting percentages if you're left-footed versus right-footed soccer players.
So since you're going with percentage, you're probably going to have some numbers. That doesn't mean that you can't do a qualitative audit, but it wouldn't come up with a percentage for you, because what we would know for qualitative would be, why do coaches pick lefties over righties, or that kind of thing. You know, would they prefer to have a lefty over a righty because of some reason? That's when you go into qualitative, probably. If you want to know just pure recruiting percentage, you're probably going to do more quantitative. What are you looking at?
It's with long snapping in football, whether one technique affects the speed better than the other technique.
Okay, so speed of the player?
Speed of the snap.
Of the snap,
Yeah.
okay. So you're just estimating the quickness of the ball going back to the quarterback, or to the punter, is that for the
Yeah.
punter? Okay, so basically, you're gonna want to do quantitative, because you want to know if one is better than the other, just pure quickness, right? Nothing else about it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if the process that they get there, how to learn it, doesn't matter really, as long as the ball gets there faster, right? Because you want the ball to get there faster, so the punter has more time, obviously. So that's probably going to be more quantitative. We could make it into qualitative, but that's not going to help where you're looking at that situation. So in those instances, those are the different things that we want to look at just for this. It's going to be descriptive. There are different ways to make it descriptive, but the lit review for qualitative and for quantitative are going to be a little bit different. Not much, because you're still going to have an introduction for your chapter 2. Because lit review for any dissertation or for a research of any sort is going to be a literature review. What you want to do is you want to find out everything you can about every aspect of your question. And that's what you're going to look at for a lit review. You're going to look at different ways to snap a punt. You're going to look at all the different ways that everybody's done, and you see which one is the best that they've said so far. You also want to look at punters and how they catch, because how they catch it is going to depend on where they want the ball. If they like it down here, if they like it up here, that's going to make a difference. So you may have to look at that. You may have to look at left and right punters. Do they want on one side or the other? Okay. Those are really specific little things that you could look up in literature. Probably not a whole lot. I'm guessing that there's not a whole lot done on that, which is a good thing for you, because that means that what you're looking at may be more important, because nobody's looked at it yet. If you have a lot, it's going to be harder, but it still could be good for you, because then you know where the hole is in the literature, where the gap is, okay? But what you're going to do on your first one, regardless of if it's quantitative or qualitative, you're going to say an introduction. Then you're going to have deconstruction of your topic. That means breaking it apart, breaking that topic apart into every form possible. So looking at recruiting, male and female, age of recruit, left and right as well, because you really want to look at that if there's anything out there on left and right. What else would you look at for recruiting? Probably Division 1, 2, or 3. Those could be different. You're going to look at all NAI for that matter too. So that's what you kind of do with your topic. You want to break it down into tiny little pieces and look at almost every word that is in your topic, so that you can see what's out there. Who's done something that is similar to what you were looking at? And it doesn't always have to relate specifically to what you're looking at, but it could, so you want to kind of look at it. And critically examine that piece to see if what they have out there is similar to what you are thinking about. So you don't always want to just read it for the current literature, which is very important, but you also want to see how much background there is. So going back to 1980 maybe, 1970 depending, you kind of want to look back there too. Not necessarily because just current stuff is great, and that's what we usually want to look at because that's what everybody is looking at. But we also need to look back and see what background there is in what you're looking for and how it's presented and studied and analyzed. So then you look at biases and prejudices on your and underlying assumptions of previous work. Underlying assumptions meaning that when they did the research, they obviously thought that it was going to come out one way. And look, it did. Then you have to be careful, because if it comes out the way you assume, then there may be something flawed in your research because you made it come out that way. And that can be a little bit tricky. And then you want a summary at the end. So a literature review, like any chapter of a book, is going to have these sections, and depending on your topic, and depending on how much you examine it, will depend on how long it is. This is probably going to be the longest part of your paper, but at the same time, if you don't have much research on it, it may be pretty short. Because if nobody's done anything on it, you can't really report on it. And all you can say is, this is all I found, and that's why I'm doing this, because nobody else has done it. And that's okay. And that's good sometimes, because then you don't have to worry about other people honing in on your idea. So plan your study, then. And I'll go through this stuff pretty quickly, because I think Dr. Wall will probably go through this again with you, or she may have already. Has she gone through chapter 2s and 3s with you at all? For your 3-chapter proposal? Not really.
She kind of said you
That I was going to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
were. Well, then she was going to touch on it, and then
Yeah.
she
And
would
we'll-
go back over it.
Yeah, she'll go back over it too with you. But the thing is, we do a lot of this in 505, so in the next one we'll do a lot of it. But I want you to kind of have an idea of what we're going for in this. So what you'll do at the end, by the end of 502, you'll need that perfect statement, okay, problem statement, and she'll have you do a annotated bibliography, which will have 10 sources. Hopefully we can find 10 for yours. I don't know if we'll find 10 or not, but 10 sources that you found that have some review already, so that we can continue on with that in 505. So that will be the beginning of your chapter 2, which will be yearly. In your planning your study, this is more about chapter 3. This is a methodology, and I'll go through some of the qualitative. She'll go through some of the quantitative a little bit more. But how you plan it, who you're going to use. I know she's told you to be specific, which is good because you really need to. And oftentimes we think it's specific, but then we start asking questions, you're like, oh yeah, I don't know. You got to get really specific on those things. So we'll go through this too. So planning a study is more about chapter 3. And chapter 3 is your methods, how you're going to go about getting your study done. You again have an introduction. Shocking. Every chapter will have an introduction and it will feel like you're repeating yourself 3 times, and you are. You get to repeat yourself a number of times. But you can't use the same words as you did in the other chapter. So you're repeating yourself but using different language. And you have a little bit of the background in chapter 3, not very much. In the introduction itself, you will say a little bit about the background. Mostly about if there's something very specific that somebody did that's similar to what you want to do. That's usually what you say in chapter 3. I'm going to look at speed with which one type of hike, is that what you call it?
Yeah, well, I'm doing it to where some people look back at their target the whole time, and some people look at the ball.
Really? They look back at the target? How do they do that?
You just look through your legs the whole time.
The whole time? You're like upside down. I can't imagine that that would be very good, because then wouldn't you get like vertigo coming back up to try to block? I would think, but I guess if you practice it enough, it would be. Okay, so if we're looking at that, then maybe somebody's already looked at other ways of hiking. And maybe they found that other ways would be better. So then you already found that, so in chapter 3 you're going to say, this has been looked at, but they didn't look at it this way, the way I'm going to look at it. So that's how you introduce your chapter 3. You have a summary of the important points of your literature review. You just want the main points that you found that were really, really relevant, not the ones that were encompassing all of the little pieces. Just the ones that were really relevant to what you were talking about. And then you want your philosophical orientation, so values, how you interpret the subject. And you tell them how the choice of methods. So then that's when you're going to say, I will be doing an experimental research project, or I'll be doing a qualitative case study, I'll be doing a phenomenological study, which I'll go over how to do those, and those kinds of things. So in this part, that's when you kind of go through your personal beliefs about the topic. You don't want to, here you have to watch out, because you don't want to say, I'm sure that coaches will recruit right-footed players more because they are more versatile. That is an assumption that you make that may not be backed up in research. So you got to be careful when you're talking about your philosophical orientation. You have to be careful in thinking that squats will help ACL injuries. You can't say something like that even though you believe it, because now you're assuming something, okay, that's not out there. So your values and everything you've learned up until now, all your experiences that you've had, you got to keep them aside, and you got to put just what you're looking at in terms of your research. And then your choice of method of how you're doing it. And then you tell them what your problem is. So the problem is that too many soccer and basketball players are getting ACL injuries. That's the problem. So you want to find out how to alleviate that problem. The problem is that the ball is not getting to the punter fast enough. So we want to alleviate the problem. Okay. So it's probably as well, most of the time, if you're going with a quantitative, this is where you put your hypothesis as well. So instead of a problem, you put the hypothesis. Anytime we're looking at problem statement for qualitative, you look at hypothesis for quantitative. So depending on which method you use, depending on which one you're going with there. Or the research question. You'll still have a research question in quantitative, which is what you're kind of developing right now. It's your research question or your problem question. And those are interchangeable, really, what we say in those basic research. So, your choice of method. So we have a case study. Hey, that didn't come up right. It wasn't supposed to come up altogether, but that's fine. In a case study, and this is what I used. I had 3 different people, actually I had 4, but case studies, I had a multiple case study that I did. A case study is each participant or each group. So if I were doing a case study on a school, I would possibly make the group each grade level. I could do that as a case study. Depending on what I was looking at and what my objective was for that. What I did for mine was on tennis, beginning tennis players. I had to find people that had never played tennis before, and I gave them lessons. Okay? So I had 4 people had never played tennis. Well, they played, but they never had lessons before, and I investigated that. So each one of them was a case study, and I put them together. So it was a multiple case study. Normally in qualitative, you probably would only pick one case study because you don't get quite as much information from one as you do with 4. So I had a lot of information that I had to figure out what to do with. But my research question was, how does counterfactual feedback, which is a certain type of feedback, promote the student's perception of developing their tennis skills? So I did not want to find out how quickly they learned how to play tennis. What I wanted to know was if they felt that the feedback helped them to feel better about them playing. So I just wanted to know if they wanted to play more. I didn't care how good they were. So I didn't measure how good they were. I could have done that for quantitative, could have done a pre and post, measured how well they hit a forehand, then I did the training, measured how well they did a backhand, compared those numbers, and there you go, I have quantitative. I didn't care about that. I wanted to know if the feedback that I was using when I taught them made them feel better about how they were playing, even if they weren't any good. But they thought they were good, and that's what I wanted to know, okay? Because if you think you're feeling better about how you play, you'll keep playing. Doesn't matter if you're good or not, as long as you think you're good. So that was my premise. But that's why I went with qualitative, because it didn't matter to me if they were good or not. If I was going to do an ethnography, and participant observation with mine, it's a kind of social research. So then you're going to look at how they see other people. Okay. You're exploring nature and social phenomena. How well do football players work together? That may be something, an ethnography type of a situation. Do they get along better than soccer players? Do they get along better than women's basketball players? That would be an ethnography type of study. You're trying to figure out how one group socializes more than another, or how they interchange, okay? How do they react to each other? You're figuring out some of their tendencies at work, okay? If you look at a group of athletic trainers compared to a group of office workers, those are the types of things that you look at for ethnography. But these are small number of cases. You don't want a big group. So I wouldn't look at a football team because you're talking about over 100 people usually. Okay? We want smaller groups. So you'd probably look at either, say, a golf team, tennis team. It's more of a small group of people rather than a big group of people. And look at them in detail. Then this nice word, phenomenology. Okay? And phenomenology looks at how people construct reality. So, if I believe that ENMU is a really high quality school, but somebody else comes in and they think that their school is more high quality, how come they have that idea and how come I have that idea? Where did it come from? That's what you're looking at in phenomenology. You also want to look at a certain group of people. So in phenomenology, one of my colleagues, she did her dissertation with phenomenology. She looked at women as football officials, women football officials in high school. There are some. There's a small group of them. Why did they choose to do that? And that's what she looked at. Because it's a small group, it's a very, rare group of individuals. And why did they decide to go into that profession? Okay, they knew what they were getting into. It's not like they didn't know. But that's what you look at in phenomenology. You research one certain group on how they react to the social situation that they're in. And then you have the grounded theory. And the grounded theory I talked about a little bit before. But the theory, in quantitative, you make up your hypothesis and then you do the research. In grounded theory, you do the research and then you make up the hypothesis. You don't have a hypothesis until after you do the research. Grounded theory says that because of the research that you're doing, you should be able to find out something. And as you go along with the research, you'll find out what works with what is proven by what, and then you find out, then you go back and forth. Then you have the theory, then you go back to doing more research. You may change your theory and go back and forth that way. So it's about the research, it's not about the actual theory. And then you have your visual methods. Visual methods is something that is used in coaching a lot, because when you're looking at a coach, and it's generally using either videos, photographs, maps, you use sketches, posters, all that kind of things in order to figure out what's going on. It's not really well respected yet, but it's starting to become more and more user friendly with, especially when you start doing coaching things, because you use videos a lot to find out what's happening with them. Using that to, how were they trained? How was the center trained before to hike to the punter? How were they trained when they were small? Sometimes you can get a video of that. Oh, they were trained this way and now they feel more comfortable doing it this way. But if they're trained this way, then they're feeling more comfortable the other way. So that's how you would use the visual methods in trying to figure out that stuff. And because it's video and because it's a picture, you can review it again and again, and you can have multiple people look at it and hopefully get the same conclusion. If you don't get the same conclusion, then you know it's not a good conclusion. But mostly, you should have the same conclusion on the visual methods. So, selecting your components, and this is part, we'll go through both for qualitative and quantitative. For qualitative, generally use a purposive sampling because you only want a certain characteristic for that person. If you do a case study, if you do phenomenology, if you do ethnography, all of those have to do with a certain kind of person. So maybe if we're doing something on students, we say female students between the ages of 18 and 20 that are up for recruiting at a Division II school and are left-footed kickers, okay? So that's how you're going to select the people that you look at. In quantitative, however, you want to do random. Does anybody know why you want to do random? Did she talk about this yet? No? You want to do random and quantitative because you will have a control group usually, and you have an experimental group. You have a group that you're going to do nothing with, and you're going to have a group that you are going to train a certain way. And if those groups are not similar, then you have no research. So if you do a random, that means that you're saying that both your groups are going to be similar. You can't do that in qualitative because we want a select characteristic of that group. My select characteristic for my dissertation was that they could not have had tennis lessons prior to entering being a participant in my study. So you have to make sure that your characteristics, if you're doing quantitative, are across the board. That means that you're going to select a group, you're going to split them up randomly so that you don't control who's in one group and who's in the other. It's a random selection. But in qualitative, you have a purposive selection. You have to have a certain group in order to make it work. They should have access to the setting, to the place, to the location that you're going to do it in. Okay? And you have to put that out there, know where you're going to do it, how are you going to test them. Are you going to use a survey? Are you going to use a computer to get the survey? Are you going to make up a questionnaire? Are you going to interview them? How are you going to make up the information or collecting the data? And where are you going to give it to them? Going to give it to them in the classroom? Is the door going to be closed so that nobody can hear? Is everybody going to be in one classroom? Or are you going to have them all separate? Everybody comes in every 5 minutes? How are you going to do it? Collecting the data, all these different ways you can collect. You can have interviews, focus groups, observations. These are mainly for qualitative. Interviews, focus groups, and observations are all about the words. They're not about the numbers. So quantitative would have a few different methods that have more numbers. You have the ANOVA, the MANOVA, you have the regression, you have all of the data types that you use once you get the numbers. But for these methods, for qualitative, you're going to use interviews, focus groups, observation. Most of the time, it's better to use all of them. So you can make sure both ways. Managing, how are you going to manage all that information? Transcripts, are you going to have a videotape? Are you going to just have a tape recorder? Then have somebody transcribe it afterwards? Who's going to transcribe it? Are you going to do it? Are you paying somebody to do it? A voice, what do they call it? Voice recognition computer program is great, but does it really work? It may miss something, and then you miss something in your research because it doesn't catch everything. As you all know, when you do text on your phone, does it always do what you tell it to say? No. So you got to go back and check. And so the same thing with that. And when it's this important for your research, kind of crucial that you get it right. So when you try to capture the data for qualitative, it's a little bit of a mess. You can have memos, you can have analysis, you can have interviews, you can have field notes. All of this stuff goes into figuring out where it comes from. So you have to have a trail of all of these different types of things. You have to figure out how you're going to make all of the data you find go into one cohesive enterprise that helps you to understand what happened. Okay. When I did mine, I did it for 8 weeks. So I met each person twice a week for 8 weeks. That's a lot of words that I had to go through to figure out if they said the same thing. If you do it with numbers, same thing. You may have tons of numbers. You got to figure out how to get them all into one box that is an audit trail so that you know what information you have. So how do you capture all of the information that you need? For qualitative, your researcher, the person that's a primary researcher is the primary instrument. I was the one giving the lessons to my group. I was the one collecting the data. I was the one interviewing. I was the one recording. I was the one having them write out field notes. I was the one describing how the lesson went at the end of each time. So I would write probably a page of field notes after each lesson to try to capture all of the information that I could about how the person felt about how they were playing. And that was just for mine. So depending on what you're looking at will depend on what you're going to find in your trying to capture in your field notes and in your interviews. Okay, so what I showed you here, and this is really small, I know, sorry. I tried to put a letter in it. This is part of what I had for my video, because I videotaped every lesson that I had for each of the person. So after the video, I paid somebody to transcribe it. I didn't do it. And they had to basically, while they were watching the video, just type everything out so that I could have it in written form. And so that's how they did this. So we just said exactly what was said on the video. And then I went through these and highlighted each piece that said something significant that I thought. And if it said something about, see, I wanted to see if they started understanding how the skill worked. So if it had something to do about the skill, so the ball hit the middle of the racket, they realized that. I would highlight that in blue, because that was about the skill. Then, and that was a bad one because I used my wrist. They realized that they shouldn't have used their wrist. So that was blue, that's part of the skill. So I used different colors depending on what they said, so that I could figure out how much they learned about the skill, how much they said about themselves. In this one, we didn't talk about them very much. So I said good, try to keep the arm straight if you can, so you want it out in front, just tap, make it tap right in the middle. Said, I am horrible. That was the person. So I would put that in yellow, because that's talking about themselves. That's what I want to know. They think they're horrible now. This is at the beginning of the lesson. At the end of the lesson, if they said something else about them being, oh, I feel better about that. Well, there I got my change, okay? And I'd highlight that in yellow. So when you're using words, it's difficult because you have to go through them all and you kind of have to interpret. And since I was the only one doing it, I also had to get somebody else to read through and see if what I picked out they agreed with or not. Because you can't just use one person's idea. It doesn't work that way. Because then you don't have any reliability. And we'll talk about that too. A little bit, not too much. We'll have to go over that. So the next one I show you, this is my, as the researcher, my field notes. So this is how specific I had to get with each of my lessons. I said what happened, we met during lunch hour, we continued to work on forehand, et cetera, et cetera. We started with warm-ups, tapping on the wall, da-da-da-da-da. So I moved to a toss 5 to 10 feet away, put exactly what I did for that whole hour. I wrote it all out. So that I could go back and check and see when she said, I am horrible, and it was on here. This is what we were doing. So that you can compare exactly what happened and what we were talking about. I don't say what I said because I already have that on there. I just described what was going on. If we were having trouble with the sun, because it was really clear, so it was at noon, it was like right overhead, and we're working on survey, and she didn't bring sunglasses, so she couldn't see the ball when she tossed it up. I had to change to something else, so I had to write that down to make sure I knew. Okay? So that's how descriptive you need to be with field notes. Field notes are something that backs up what you have in the video. So we go with analyzing and interpreting data. That's part part of analyzing and interpreting is having transcription and having field notes so that you can figure out what to do. So bracketing is one way. Like I said before, you have key phrases that I looked for. I looked for key things that they said about their skill, and I highlighted those. Categories, okay? I am horrible. That's a category. That's something that they said about themselves. So that's what I was looking for. Memos about what happened, okay? If they said something else about, maybe later they talked about, well, it's not so bad, okay? So they're changing a little. That's called bracketing, when you start changing things into something that you can use. And then you try to make them into themes. So categories and themes are very similar, okay? Even key phrases and themes. Themes are what you want to look at in terms of overall. I had 4 different themes, and I'll show you those in a little bit, of where I looked at exactly what all 4 people were talking about at some time or another. I think that's the next one. And themes are the inductive process. That's what you use, and this you probably can't read because it's really tiny. So each one of these is an answer from one of the questions that I had at the end. At the end of every lesson that I had, we had probably 5 or 6 questions that I asked each person. They answered, and I had to write them all down. So I wrote every single answer down, and then I put them in beside each other in an Excel sheet so I could compare what each said compared to the next one. And most of those, then I could tell if they all said the same thing or not. Okay? In this one, these were journal entries, so they also, once a week, wrote down, I sent questions home with them, and they wrote down how they felt about each thing, and they brought it back the next day. So I had journal entries and I had interview questions, both to try to combine to see if they're saying the same thing. Okay. So they got free lessons, but they had to do some work for me to get those free lessons. So those are how I got them into themes, by making that specific category that I was talking about. Okay, if I asked them about the skill itself, if they understood how to do a forehand skill, or if I asked them how they felt about how they did a forehand skill. Then it would just depend on that question category going into that. So, since we have all these words and these people that are saying all this stuff, how can we have scholarly rigor? Well, first of all, what is scholarly rigor? That's a big word. They might know what it means. What does scholarly rigor mean? What do you think?
Is there like terms, like the way they talk, or?
No, but that's a good guess. Scholarly rigor means that how do we know that what they said is really what they said? And how can I prove that when they said, I am horrible, that means that they don't feel very good about themselves? And that's what scholarly rigor is. It means that just because they said, I feel horrible, does not necessarily mean that they don't like the way they're playing. Maybe that just means they felt bad that day. Okay, but I interpreted it as them saying that they didn't like how they were playing. Well, so somebody else may interpret it differently. So how can I make sure that I have exactly what I say I'm having in my research? How can I make sure that they actually did feel better about themselves playing when they... Is there any trustworthiness to what I found? Because I was the only one listening to them, so can I really rely on what I interpret? Because every single person has some bias to what you're going to do. You have looked at the stuff, by the time you start doing this, you have looked at so much research on your subject, you know more about it than anybody else. So you're gonna be biased about what you find out because you've already looked at it so much. So how do we keep it so that we're not biased? That's what scholarly rigor is. How do we get it to be trustworthy? There's a couple of ways that we can do that. And this is why many scholars do not like qualitative, because they don't think we can ever get scholarly rigor out of qualitative. But there is a way to do it. How credible is the information that you get? Well, kind of depends, okay? But that if it's credible, then it goes to trustworthiness. Then you can trust it if it's credible. There's a couple of ways to do that. We have member checks, which means that every time after I did an interview with them, I let them read over what I had typed in as their answer, so that they checked to make sure that what I had typed in was actually what they were saying. So I had to look at that. Then you also have, you compare it to internal validity. You have somebody else read it, and you say, this is what I think they're saying. Do you think that's what they're saying? Okay. So you have an expert, somebody else, that is helping you to read and make sure that what you are seeing in their answer is actually what is in their answer. So that's credibility. You have transferability. Then you have, can the person, the reader, can make inferences about the information applied to your own situation. This is compared to external validity. So credibility is usually what we compare to internal validity, and transferability is what we compare to external validity and quantitative. So in quantitative, you have internal validity and external validity. So these two are what we compare for qualitative. And you also have dependability. How consistent is it? Well, the reason I had dependability was because I had 4 different ways that they could say the same thing. I had interviews, because I asked them questions, they told me an answer. I had journals. They took the questions home and they wrote down the answer. I had my field notes. I wrote exactly what happened during the class, and then I also had somebody else look at it. So there are 4 different ways that I'm going to see if I have the consistent information that I need. And that's the dependability part. Finding out if all of your notes, all of the audio tapes that I had, the video transcriptions that I had, said the same thing as what the interviews and the journals said. Did all of them say the same thing? If they did, then that's good, because you've got 3 different ways to make sure that that happened. And this dependability is compared to reliability in quantitative. Your reliability is essential for quantitative, it also is for qualitative, but we call it dependability. Confirmability, can you confirm what you have? Or is objectivity unattainable? So, can I make sure, it's similar to dependability, because you have all of those different things, but can I confirm it by saying that the interview and the journal said exactly the same thing? And it said it on the video as well. So now I have transcription, I have journal entries, and I have interviews that all say the same thing, and they can confirm from one to the other. So then I have the evidence of trustworthiness. Because you have the audit trail that we used. We have interviews, we have journals, we have transcription, we have description of the actual lesson. The other thing you want to do with evidence of trustworthiness, and this is something that goes with quantitative as well as qualitative, you want to clarify what your bias is before you even do the research. So you're going to say that I am biased toward this research because I know that this should work. That's just simple, but that's kind of what you're going to say. You're going to say something about that you know, you recognize your bias. Were you a cunt snapper?
Yes.
So you're biased because you already did that, okay? And you can say that ahead of time. If you say it ahead of time, then it's okay, all right? Because you've performed it so many times, you're going to be biased. That's just the way it is. Because I've taught tennis so many times, I was already going to be biased because I've taught it to too many people. So I already had bias in there. You're already going to have some bias. Have you recruited left and right-footed people?
No, no, it's left.
You're left-footed, so you're biased. There you go. So you want to make sure that you say that ahead of time. And then, once you get your results, you already have evidence that you're okay because you realize that you're biased. So admitting the bias helps to get you continued through there. Triangulation is another word that we use for evidence of trustworthiness in qualitative. And triangulation means that I have at least 3 different ways that I've found the same thing. So I had the transcription, I had the journal, and I had the interview questions. That triangulation helps me to say that it's trusting. The information is there. You also have member checking. Member checking means that after I've written down what they said, I show this to them, and they confirm that what I have written down is what they said. So I check with them to make sure that what I have written down is correct. And then you have peer debriefing. So I'm going to ask a peer to watch that. Need to plug it in?
Yeah.
They also had in the book negative case checking, but they don't do that anymore, so I'm not going to go over that. So hopefully she doesn't have a question about that for you. And that's the one. So those are the main things on qualitative compared to quantitative. How many questions do we have? It is very different, but at the same time, you go through the same types of things. You have the same things on both sides. You have, you need reliability and validity on both sides. You need it quantitative, you need it qualitative. You call them different things, but it's basically the same. You want to have some type of form to be able to say that what I am doing is a valid way. And that way you can make it a little more credible and a little bit more so that you can apply it to other places. So when if you do a recruiting on left and right-footed soccer players, whoever you take as your population or your participants in your study, depending on how many there is, will depend on if you can apply it to everybody else in the U.S. Because if you only do it with a certain group, you can really only apply it to that group. You can't apply it to anybody else. When I did mine in qualitative, I only have 4 people. I cannot apply that information to anybody else because it's only 4 people. Out of the millions of people in the world, I can't make it. Say that other 4 people would do the same thing, because they won't. Okay? If you have enough people, that's why quantitative, that's why they go with quantitative, because you can have a large group of people for doing that. But if that's not the question you have, then it doesn't matter. So because my question was about the perception, it didn't matter if I only had 4. I know that that worked with the 4 that I had. So now I have to do it again. And that's when you replicate the same type of research to do it again with a different group. If you come out with the same, oh, now you can say that it works for everybody. So if you're looking at an exercise to help ACL injuries, and I know there's a lot of information out on ACL because actually another doctoral student was doing one on ACL in volleyball. And I don't know if he finished his or not. He got a job, so I don't know if he finished his dissertation, but I know he was doing it on ACL injuries. He was an athletic trainer too. And I don't think he was trying to find out what, well, he did do some on jump rope. You can tell, I don't know if he ever finished, but you could tell from watching them jump rope, you could tell who was going to be more susceptible to ACL injuries because of how they landed. So he did prove that, but I don't know what else is out there, so you'll have to look at that. But I know he had a huge book full of research, so there's quite a bit. So what we might want to do with yours is narrow it down to specifically, are you doing just the women's group, or are you going to do?
Yeah, just
Okay.
so much more.
Yeah, so you might want to narrow it down to even more than that. My recommendation for anybody to, if you're going to do participants, is to do them over 18, just because then you don't have to get parent permission. But, you know, there are some people that have one, Carly, she's in our 505, and she wants to know about younger kids, so sometimes you have to hope that the parents allow you to do it. And it's good to do it with kids, because then you can predict later on, but it's hard. So, do any of you really want to go on to do the actual research? Do you want to do it as your culminating activity for your master's? Do you want to do a thesis? Okay, that's good, it'd be good. But if you don't, that's fine too, but it's still good to look at. I mean, if you're interested in that, then it's kind of fun to look at that stuff and see what they've done before. I always like looking at research anyway, so see if you can make them get a faster snap, and then those punters don't have any worry about getting hit. Right? That way you can get well known. So, okay? So, make sense? Any questions? Let me know, but hopefully you got a little bit on qualitative, and it's a good way to find some different things out. So, depending on what you want to know. So, do you need to upload that, or how do you do that usually?
Oh, for this, I'm just gonna, yeah, I can upload it.
Okay.